Okay, so EBI 2 is to explain the migration of water using the water cycle. And what I mean by migration means the movement of water through the water cycle. And I know this is a challenge question. However, this is a very good question to practice to test your knowledge and your understanding of the water cycle. So it is a good question to practice on. The main question is telling us to explain how the water molecules in the iceberg could end up as water in a lake. So when considering this question, you should have in your mind the water cycle, which we looked at in the previous EBI point. Another thing to consider is the changes of state, such as solid, liquid, and gas, because the iceberg is a solid. So this iceberg is a solid, and somehow it needs to end up in a lake. So it can end up going into the ocean, but it could also end up going into a lake. And how is that going to happen? Well, we need to think about the water cycle in this case. So I'm going to show you a couple of answers that we've got, and this was a bit of a challenging question, so I don't think anyone got full marks in their answers. So here's some of the answers that I've got. The water cycle was to keep reproducing. So there is some grammar that needs to be corrected there. The next one is the water evaporates from the surface of the sea, and water in the iceberg is in the solid state. So they've mentioned two things here, but it doesn't get the full 4 marks. So again, look at the question here. It says 4 marks. So you should have some 4 main points to discuss. And this person has written down that it evaporates from the surface of the sea, which is good. They've said one of the processes in the water cycle, evaporation. And they've also said another process here, which the water in the iceberg is in a solid state. But they should have said that it also melts. So they could say that it melts. A melting is when a solid turns into a liquid, right? So when the ice turns into water. But this will also not get a mark. So these two answers will not get a mark simply because they haven't really mentioned about the whole water cycle. What is happening in that water cycle? The next one says the iceberg melts and end up in water. That's a good start. So I would say this answer is a good start. But again, I wouldn't say it earns more than 1 mark with this one. They would be lucky if they get 1 mark, but I would say that it still does not get a mark. They need to talk about that whole process in the water cycle. So you have this water cycle to work with and explain what's happening. So we're looking at the command verb here, explain, and explain is to state something and justify it. So you need to give reason and evidence of what you're saying. So I'm going to show you how we can get that right answer. First, I'm going to show you the mark scheme. So this is our mark scheme. Ideally, you should be aiming for level 2, which is 3 to 4 marks. So you have a detailed, coherent explanation of how water molecules transfer through the water cycle from one form to another. Okay, and there's going to be logical links. So this is the indicative content. So ideally, you should have most of this in your answer. So you don't have to have all of it in your answer, but as long as you can talk about some of these points. And I'll show you an example. So I'm going to try and attempt and answer this question using what we've seen from the mark scheme. So Okay, so we have an iceberg, and an iceberg, as we've said before, is a solid state, right? So it's a solid state, and I'm going to draw an iceberg here. This is an iceberg. This blue thing here, that's this iceberg. Now, we can say the iceberg melts. So when we say melting, the water turns in, so the ice turns into water. You can say liquid water, just to be more specific. And then you can say in the ocean, which is this one here, this is the ocean already, so the water has melted into the ocean. So the iceberg melts, the ice turns into liquid water into the ocean. So you can say into the ocean. And then you can say that the water then evaporates. Okay, so that's number one here. It evaporates. And you can say it turns into water vapor. Evaporates into water vapor. So we know that that's a gas. So you can say gas in brackets. So it's turned into gas. So this is your evaporation happening. And then at number two, what happens at number two again? It condenses. The water condenses and forms clouds. Okay, so it turns into clouds right over here. When the clouds get heavy, what happens again? It turns into precipitation. So precipitation occurs. So precipitation occurs, and that leads back into the rivers and lakes. Okay, so that would in generally give you the 4 marks because you talk about the different processes that's occurring in the water cycle. So let's just highlight some key points here. We talk about the iceberg melting. So the iceberg melts. The ice turning into liquid water because it's melting into the ocean. The water then evaporates. So that's another process that we've discussed. The water evaporates into water vapor, and that water condenses and forms into clouds. So we talk about condensation, and then we also talk about precipitation. Okay, so if you look back, we could look into evaporation over here. We talked about the iceberg melting. We talked about condensation that's occurring, and the clouds moving around, and then we also talked about precipitation. Okay, and it all links. Okay, so even though I haven't got all these points, it still makes sense of the water cycle that's occurring from the iceberg here, the iceberg, turning into clouds, turning into precipitation, and leading back into the rivers and lakes. So that's how you would answer this question. You really need to have a firm understanding of the water cycle.